This is Dread Delusion, and it does something that I haven't really seen other games try to attempt. That's because when a game comes along and does something so unique and innovative that it's propelled into popularity, it's always followed by droves of copycats, for lack of a better word, that use its framework as their core game design. Of course, a lot of them end up being mindless cash grabs, but there's always that few that stand out from the crowd and make a name for themselves. It's never the original game itself, but the games that attempt to emulate them that give birth to what we know as subgenres. If a game has heavy emphasis on stamina management, losing all your experience upon death, and a high difficulty ceiling, we call these Souls-likes. The same is true for games where you reach a specific area that looks like where you need to be to progress, but is either blocked off or out of reach, causing you to turn around and explore until you eventually find some ability or piece of gear to explore that area. We call these Metroidvanias. Games like Doom, Rogue, System Shock, and Deus Ex, even Nintendo's Animal Crossing series. They've all had their fair share of clones, but I can't think of any that have tried their hands at the Bethesda formula, more specifically the Elder Scrolls. That's why I find this game so strange, because it feels like it belongs to a subgenre of games that doesn't really exist. The Elder Scrolls should have been one of these genre-defining moments in history where you see multiple clone-like surface. Just look at the success of Skyrim. It was so groundbreaking you can practically track the shift in open world games that started being released after 2011. If we look back on games like Assassin's Creed, Red Dead Redemption, and Shadow of Mordor, we see that these games used to be fairly compact and story-driven. But if we look at the most recent iterations of these games, they're packed with so many events, side quests, and distractions, you can find yourself spending dozens of hours in between major story beats, and I believe this is what has been causing open world fatigue with many players. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with these types of games. I think games like Dragon Age Inquisition and Breath of the Wild are proof that this type of design can be incredible, but when every open world game tries to match Skyrim in scope, it can become exhausting. It's actually pretty funny comparing Skyrim to the open world games of today because now it's considered to be fairly small, but it's the sheer amount of depth in its world and the amount of gameplay systems it has that makes it so immersive even by today's standards. The exploration felt so organic, you couldn't walk 2 steps without being distracted by something interesting. A lot of open world games today just feel like it takes longer to get to that interesting thing. They never quite scratch that itch, you know? At least for me they don't. That desire to wander off in any direction, never really knowing what to expect. Climbing the top of that mountain or searching some tucked away corner and actually finding something cool. The sheer amount of stuff you can pick up and interact with. All this is either missing from other games or just too boring to engage with. That's why I love indie games so much, because more often than not they feel curated to a specific playstyle and the devs had a clear vision for what the game should be. A lot of bigger studios just have too many cooks in the kitchen and can be so ambitious that they forget to give each individual system the proper amount of development. So if there isn't any games that take a holistic approach to this type of game design, the question still remains, why isn't there a Scrolls-like genre? To find that answer, I did what I always do in these situations. I delved into the backwaters of Steam and went on my own little choose-your-own-adventure quest in search of such an elusive title. Now, I did find a game called Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon, which I eventually want to talk about once it's out of early access because, man, this is definitely looking worthy of the Scrolls-like genre. But Dread Delusion caught my eye simply because of its striking resemblance to Morrowind of all things. And what I thought was going to be a bite-sized little indie clone of early Elder Scrolls games, admittedly because of its PS1 style graphics, turned out to be one of the few ambitious attempts at building something franchise-worthy I've seen from an indie game. Hollow Knight and Hades being a couple of examples. Dread Delusion's world building and writing are like they took a small team from Bethesda and From Software and said, make us a game in the style of Morrowind, but crank the Bizarro slider to 11 and fill it with cosmic horror. And oh yeah, throw in a little dash of 40K on top of it. That's what this game's world feels like to me. You play as a prisoner of the Inquisition on the Oniric Isles, these floating islands under the backdrop of a blood-tinged sky marked by an ominous star. This once technologically advanced civilization was brought to destruction and is now holding on to what little humanity is left from the aftermath. The apostatic union is hunting down the non-believers of their religious ideology like the Crusades of the medieval ages. But instead of the gods being their primary motivator, it's their faith in science leading them to stamp out any attempts at god worship they come across. So they hunt down the believers of these old gods and lay down their punishments. In this world, the gods aren't invincible deities. They rely on prayer and blood sacrifices in order to survive. Without them, they're destined to wither and die. The Inquisition found these rituals to be inhumane, which sparked a war against the gods, causing the last of them to either go into hiding or to be snuffed out entirely. When it comes to gameplay, it's definitely inspired by old school RPGs, even as far back as Kingsfield. For starters, the exploration in Dread Delusion does not hold your hand, like at all. The NPCs and quest givers will give you general directions on where you need to be, but other than that, it's up to you to make it there without any quest markers or anything on screen to point you forward. At one point, I made it to a nearby village and bought a compass from the shopkeep, and I had to physically hold this compass up anytime I wanted to orient myself. In games where you have to constantly glance at mini-maps to see if you're on the right path, taking your attention away from these beautifully crafted worlds you're supposed to be immersed in, this slower pace to exploration is a breath of fresh air. I remember churning off the HUD in Far Cry Primal because I thought it made no sense for my prehistoric caveman to be navigating the world by way of GPS. The setup has that familiar Elder Scrolls introduction, if you know you know. At the beginning of the game, locked in a prison cell because, of course you are, you choose your starting stats. You got your typical fighter, magic user, and thief builds that you can kind of mix and match, but it's nothing too crazy. I thought it was pretty basic myself, there being no character customization and all. I mean, there's no third-person view or anything like that. You don't even see your character when changing your equipment either. But it didn't really bother me because in this way, I found I was able to fully put myself into whatever role I was choosing. If you do decide to play this game, please pick the hard mode because the normal difficulty is so easy it basically renders all of its gameplay systems null and void. The combat is pretty fleshed out, so the fact that you can essentially kneecap your gameplay experience by playing it the intended way is kind of a strange decision in my opinion. If you don't like the random dice rolls of Morrowind, you don't have to worry here. The combat is closer to Oblivion. All your sword swings hit the enemies, and I had fun with the stamina and parry mechanics when it comes to swordplay. You have your basic ranged weapons, stealth multipliers, and spell slots, but like I said, the exploration in this game is where you're gonna find most of the challenge and reward. Besides the opening, I didn't hear any voice acting either. This is by all means a text-heavy narrative like Morrowind was. I know this can be off-putting to some people having to read a lot, but like I said, what's here is fantastic. Characters don't just feed you information, they convey personality, body language, and what their emotional state is. For example, when you meet the High Confessor at the beginning, she doesn't just say to you, "Your service is required, prisoner." It reads, a woman's voice, hoarse and raspy, echoes from within the device. "Your service is required, prisoner." This isn't just flavor text. This novelization to every conversation is better than a lot of games with actual voice dialogue. I could feel the blanket of fungal spores in the air around me as the NPCs would often cough and sneeze during dialogue. And the atmosphere of this game easily makes it one of the best settings I've seen in an RPG with its ethereal music and industrial ambience as you walk out to the floating islands for the first time. And I don't know about you, but the low poly aesthetic and compressed sounds of older games in particular always had this air of creepiness to them, like the long ambiguous halls of a dungeon crawler. They always felt like these creepypastas you would hear about with photos of liminal spaces. That, along with some of the religious iconography, can make for some pretty disturbing shit too. Like the Iron Maiden character, for example, reminded me of the torture dungeons during the medieval ages, where heretics were placed in this contraption, its internal walls dotted with iron spikes. This torture device wasn't meant to kill the victim instantly, but to slowly bleed them to death. These spikes are done in such a way too that they don't puncture any of the internal organs, and once the door is closed, multiple stab wounds are caused all at once. In the shoulders, the chest, lower back, and stomach. This inflicted unimaginable pain, and the darkness of the enclosed space only enhanced the misery. Any movement at all only deepened the wounds. This is extremely horrific, but what makes it more disturbing is that it's crowned with the face of a virgin woman, the inner chamber symbolizing her womb, and the victim being the impurity of menstruation. This baptization by way of torture is administered to absolve the heretic or non-believer of all their sins, as the bodily suffering would purify their soul in preparation for the afterlife. That's why the character design of the High Confessor just gave me an idea of how dark and brutal this world is, as she wears the pain this device brings her like a badge of honor. Only the highest ranks of the Inquisition are worthy of this much suffering. Circling back to the Elder Scrolls, the escapism is the reason why a lot of people play these games in the first place. There's something about the fantasy setting being so far removed from reality that it helps drown out the background noise of all the real-world bullshit we have to contend with on a daily basis. Dread Delusion, by extension, offers this same type of distraction. In a world where multi-billion-dollar studios try to add detail into every blade of grass, that experience becomes diminished. I don't want to feel like I'm living in real life when I play a game. I want to feel like I'm taking a break from it. Now, I don't know if there'll ever be a definitive Scrolls-like genre, but I do know this. Dread Delusion is a fantastic trip down memory lane for any Elder Scrolls fan. Thanks for watching. Bye.